And we're live. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. We're all still on lockdown, of course. This is the Factor 8 live stream for the 20th of April 2020. And we're joined live on the line today by Kat Lanteigne, who is a Toronto based writer, actor, and the executive director and co founder of bloodwatch.org, a non profit organization advocating for a safe, voluntary public blood system in Canada. So, Kat, obviously, we were just talking there. It sounds like you're all on lockdown as much as we are at the moment.
Yes, we are. Yeah, and it's been very cold here in Toronto. We've had a long winter and it's been a really cold spring. So, we're just sort of forced indoors and hoping that this tragedy starts to release everybody from its grip as soon as possible.
Sure. I mean, we're certainly going to come on to issues about the current situation and the blood supply a bit later on. But I think to begin with, Kat, I think a lot of people that will, listen today will have heard about you, will have seen, bits and pieces. But for those who don't, could you I thought maybe it was best to start really by you, if you could just maybe explain your personal connection to the Tainted Blood Scandal and how you even became aware of it to begin with.
Well, it's I sort of said to my husband the other day, I said, it is amazing to me that my life has actually been so impacted by the viruses that have caused devastation, in my 40 odd years. And AIDS was one of those. My uncle contracted HIV and subsequently died in 2001 from complications with AIDS. He contracted HIV sexually. He was a gay man. And my godmother's sister, Janet Connors, contracted HIV from her husband, who was a hemophiliac. And Randy and Janet were both two people who came out very early during the Tainted Blood crisis and made their story public, which was a huge mental game changer in Canada because I think Janet might have been the first woman to become public with her HIV status, but she was also an incredible advocate, and she headed up the compensation fight for people who had been secondarily infected or impacted. So children who were going to be orphaned either by one parent or both parents because of tainted blood, people who had been infected by their spouses because many hemophiliacs weren't told, even from the organizations that were meant to represent them,
Right.
that they were exposed earlier on. It's very similar to what happened in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was young when that was happening, but it had a tremendous impact on me. I was very close to my uncle. It was devastating to me when he passed away. Janet is still alive, living in Nova Scotia with her beautiful grown son and is a grandma now.
Mm-hmm.
And that experience of seeing the devastation of what a virus had done that had been so politicized, and witnessing that just deep-seated corruption within our Canadian government was really difficult for me to digest. I didn't understand it at a young age.
Yeah. Well,
and I always found it really interesting that I remember walking into my basement when my mom and my godmother Lois were watching Janet and Randy on television when they first became public on the news, and they were both crying, and I said to them, what's going on? And my mom looked at me and said, Janet and Randy have been betrayed. And I thought it was such a strange thing to say, because of course I didn't even really know what they meant, but though they were adult women, right, witnessing that in real time. And that profoundly had an impact on me. So it was later on that I had tried to make a film about the Tainted Blood crisis, and particularly Janet's story.
Well, let's just, because I do want to come on to kind of what you did later, but to kind of try and take this in some chronological order. So just to give kind of people watching and listening a bit of context, so in October 93, the Krever inquiry chaired by Horace Krever was a public inquiry set up to investigate the Tainted Blood Scandal in Canada. It reported in 1997. And Kat, at what point did you go back? Because obviously you were quite young at that time. At what point did you go back to look at Krever and to start to really research the history?
Let's see, that would have been, well, I understood it when it was happening because it was a constant conversation in our household, right? Because it was happening to essentially an extended family member.
Sure.
But I think it would have been, let's see, I think it was 2007. So it was just the year because I graduated from Bristol Vic Theatre School.
Yeah.
And after I had left, when I came home, I said to my husband, I said, you know what, if it's too difficult to get a film off the ground, I think what I really need to do is write a play.
Sure.
And so I went back in really intensely then.
Yeah, and so that was in 2013, your play Tainted opened in Canada, and that play was about the Tainted Blood Scandal.
Yes, I had done almost a 3-year research project prior to that. I mean, I was sort of working on it and figuring out what I was going to do before, but between 2010, like late 2009 and 2013, I interviewed and connected with Tainted Blood family members across the country. I connected with Justice Krever, of course, with hemophiliacs that had been involved with fighting for justice, and lawyers, different people that were a part of the process to get a real picture of a broad story. Because when I was writing the play, I didn't want to shoulder one family with sort of being responsible with the story, if you know what I meant.
Sure.
I wanted it to be accurate, but I wanted it to be a culmination of those events and make it a very personal human story. So the story is not sort of an Aaron Brockovich story. The story really in Tainted is how a family tries to cope, with sort of loving each other and staying intact when all of this stuff is tearing them apart and unraveling at this rapid pace.
And how was the play received when it came out?
Well, it was received really well. It was very overwhelming. Because we did an independent production. I mean, we had these amazing A-list like theater actors who were a part of our show, and that was fantastic. But what had happened just the year prior to the play opening was that these paid plasma facilities, these blood broker sites, were setting up shop in Ontario. So the play ended up happening at a time when everything that Justice Krever had recommended against Canada doing was about to happen again.
Right.
So we were in this incredible position where we could use a piece of live theater to be a platform for a larger conversation, which we did. And that's another reason as well. Dr. Don Francis flew up from California.
Yeah.
And participated in talkback discussions. And we used it to force the Ontario government to implement a law that shut them down.
Yeah, I mean, just coming back to something you said there. Making the play, you interviewed people, families affected by the scandal. How did you find that, and why did you feel that was an important thing to do? Because obviously you having this personal connection, in theory you could have just gone ahead and done this yourself based off your own family's experience, but you didn't. You went out there to speak to other people.
Well, I had done so much reading, just an exorbitant amount of reading, outside of Krever's report, which I've studied. Essentially, it's been part of my life's work. And the supporting documentation, which I got from, unfortunately, his name, who has passed away since, John Plater, who was a hemophiliac, co-infected hemophiliac, and a lawyer who fought for justice during the Krever inquiry. And one of the characters in the play is loosely based on him and one of his colleagues. It was so important to me because I was impacted by AIDS by the AIDS crisis, and I understood the grief. I understood the immense frustration and anger that people had, but I felt a deep responsibility that it still wasn't my story, because I was not infected with HIV or hepatitis C, and I wasn't a parent who had lost a child. So in my personal view, and some writers don't do this, and it doesn't mean that their work isn't equally, you know what I mean, like acceptable or justified.
Sure.
But for me, I felt an obligation to do as much work as possible. I was open with every family member that I was writing a play. They knew that. They knew that I would pick and choose of how to build that structure. So that was important for me because they're sharing very personal information. Mm-hmm. And because people had different particular circumstances of when they found out, how they found out, where they were in Canada at the time, I think what it did was it helped to make the play very specific and ring true, because eventually all that stuff comes out. And when you're working on an artistic piece about an events and a part of history that is so profoundly important, I think we have an obligation to get it right. You know what I mean? Because if you do the show and somebody smells stuff that's not authentic, it doesn't work. And then you have done the people who lived it a disservice. So I felt a really, really deep obligation to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, let's come back to Krever. I mean, I think, I was doing quite a lot of research earlier on today ahead of this, and looking back at kind of the history of the scandal in Canada and everything that happened. And I think one of the craziest situations that I've read that happened with the Krever inquiry was that in Canada, like happens with inquiries here, Krever sent out these notices to people that were subject to blame in the report, and he was taken to court by these people saying he had overstepped the mark. Now, those at blame lost that argument, but he certainly did criticize people. And how key would you say that, or do you think that Horace Krever was as an individual in terms of the Krever inquiry? Because it seems like it was such a massive thing to the victims and families.
He's a hero, and he would never subscribe to that definition. And the reason why he is because he has such tremendous gravitas, not just as justice, but as a policy mind. So he is extremely grounded, fair-minded individual, and totally apolitical. And so, the Ottawa is no different from any other large, federal body. Really, they are largely a political machine, and they serve their own interests. And that interest isn't the interest of the good; it's the interest of the machinery of the government. So they didn't want him to name it because they knew they were going to have to pay out all this additional compensation, because they knew they, messed up exponentially. Mm-hmm. So the great thing about Justice Krever is that he was so detailed in his work, and he never fell into any of the traps that sometimes these inquiries or these can fall into. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He commanded a level of respect in the room by everybody, and I remember some of the lawyers telling me that when they would behave in a way of like cross-examining that you would do in a trial, he would stop them and remind them that that's what this is not what we're here for. This is a fact-finding mission to lay down facts, full stop. Mm-hmm. That is our job. And when they went on the road, he would remind and come in and once in a while, apparently, to the pub when everybody was drinking and sort of finger wag, like everybody's old professor. And so the level of dignity that he brought, and an incredible amount of genuine empathy. So that is why he is so revered among tainted blood survivors and their family members. Mm. But he is also revered greatly within the legal community across Canada, because there's not a lot of Justice Krevers out there anymore.
Yeah. So, I mean, as far as the outcome of that inquiry, how do the Canadian victims and families feel about the outcome now? I mean, do people feel in Canada that it's finished? You know, it's over. Are people still campaigning? What is the situation now?
Well, there's still a campaign that's going on for a particular group of um, tainted blood survivors for a hepatitis C fund. You know, there's a group, I think it's about 300 people that were left out of a specific compensation package. So there's that kind of legal wrangling that gets dragged on.
Right.
Um, and you know, this current administration here, the prime minister's party, political party, had promised that they would settle that, and of course they didn't. I mean, most of them never do, right? They use the tactic of delay because they can,
Yeah.
within the bureaucracy, to tire people out, drown them in legal fees, so they stop, or they wait until people die.
Yeah, no,
That's what they do.
I totally, you know, I think many people here would say that's exactly what goes on here, as you say, tiring people out, you know, hoping that people will go away, and it grinds people down, you know, and people, understandably, they give up. Some people, and I can totally understand why, you know.
Yeah.
But hey, I guess that's politicians for you. I mean, something else that you know, people will be very familiar with, it's mentioned many times, is famously after the Krever inquiry, there was a criminal investigation that was began into the Armour pharmaceutical company and the Canadian Red Cross, and by 2007 there were 5 defendants, 25 criminal charges, and the main trial returned a verdict of not guilty on all counts. What impact did that have on people at the time? Because I'd imagine that was quite demoralizing at that time.
Yeah, some of our co-founding members, you know, were participants in that. It was devastating. It still is today. It's, you know, it's hard not to, when you're an advocate on behalf of this part of history, not be broken when you witness so many people who have been broken, and completely unnecessarily, right? If we had a government system that behaved in a different way, you know, we wouldn't find ourselves in these kinds of horrific circumstances that treat people in such an inhumane manner. And so I would say that it's just continually devastating. And there's some people who have been able to put it in a place and go on with their lives for whatever lives they have left, either people who are who have been directly infected with HIV or hepatitis C. And a lot of the dads that I know who had to bury their children are very stoic, quiet men, because it's just too difficult to face. And the mums find a way to celebrate their children in the best way that they know how. You know, in this experience that I've had in Canada, and it's just sort of, there is, you know, the only thing that I have heard repeatedly from that's been really common across the country has been, we just never want it to happen again.
Yeah.
There is nothing we can do, you know, to change history, but I want to make sure that my, you know, son or daughter or loved one did not die for nothing.
Sure. Well,
that is what I want.
I mean, on that note, let's talk a little bit about Bloodwatch, the organization you represent. Your primary objective, as far as I can tell, is to have the sale of blood plasma outlawed across all of Canada, and for it to be a voluntary thing.
Yes, and internationally, like we support. Bloodwatch had standing at in Strasbourg last year at the EU's Commission's, you know, meeting on plasma and the security of the blood supply. So what happened is, when we did that play and we sort of shut down blood brokers, because there's this premise that because we have not had a new bloodborne virus that has infected the blood supply, that there's no risk. That's the argument, right? So the argument is that pooled plasma is no longer a risk anymore because technology has caught up.
Sure, yeah.
And we say, actually, the safest donors are scientifically donors that donate voluntarily.
Yeah.
And the safest way to operate blood systems for both blood and plasma is to do that under national bodies. So you have transparency, you have tracebacks, that you can do, and you're also not co-opting the donor, right? Because it was very common back then for people to lie about their behavior because they were being paid to sell their blood plasma.
Sure. Yeah.
And the industry, the paid plasma industry, is known to source their plasma from exceptionally impoverished communities in the United States. And due to COVID-19, of course, with the bottom dropping out of the economy all over the world, people are going to be even more desperate for cash. So when you have a new virus that emerges, you're safe in the donors, and the safest way to manage the base is nationalized integrated public system. And so you prevent human tissue essentially from being, internationally traded commodity, and instead it becomes a public resource used for the public good for patients who need it. That is our, that's the work that we do.
Well, I think with just something you mentioned there, and I know you were keen to talk about this, is issues in the blood supply today. Obviously, you've mentioned COVID-19. I know there are other viruses that Bloodwatch is actively concerned about. What are those? What are kind of the newer issues today beyond HIV and hepatitis?
Well, one of the things, I mean, we're doing the best we can to keep up on COVID-19. So far, they base it primarily on other research that a coronavirus hasn't, been transfused. For the most, coronaviruses are known to be killed during the pooled plasma process, but there's other issues that we are watching, and this all has to do primarily with policy, right? That they argue that everything has to be based on science, but what we're finding is that if the science isn't convenient in early stages and they don't use the precautionary principle, that's how we get into trouble with the blood supply, which is exactly what happened during so today there is a new prion disease, which is akin to mad cow / BSE, called chronic wasting disease. It's in 26 states in the US, and it's in 3 Canadian provinces. It's the only prion disease that's found in the both wild and farmed populations, because bizarrely, we farm deer and elk in Canada and in the United States.
Right.
And so it is a strikingly unique disease. So chronic wasting disease can be found in every part of the animal. Whereas BSC, it was in this, the spine and the brain.
Yeah.
And what the incredibly important thing about this new prion disease is that the animals shed it. So they're literally shedding infectious prions out of their antlers, out of the urine or saliva, and it takes up in the soil and in water, and it can persist in those environments for years.
Wow.
And yeah, so what happened in 2017 is a Canadian-German team led by our own Canadian government scientist named Dr. Stephanie Schub. They discovered that macaque monkeys, which are the closest related to humans, after eating the equivalent to a 7-ounce steak a month, tested positive for chronic wasting disease.
Wow. So this really is something to be taken as seriously as mad cow disease.
Yes, and so the thing is that we co-wrote a letter and signed a letter with his name's Dr. Michael Osterholm. He's the a scientific envoy to the U.S. president, 5 years to 5 different presidents, not just this current president, and he was one of many scientists and agricultural specialists that we co-signed this letter with. Of course, our focus was on the blood supply, saying to the current administration, Prime Minister Trudeau and his government, you have to implement precautionary measures to get this meat out of the food chain.
Mm.
because we don't want to inherit the problem, right? If we have a human case, it's too late. That means it's everywhere. Um, and they just ignore it. So what people don't know is that in Canada, we exposed on the CBC through documents that we acquired from the federal government that for 5 years they have been permitting every single farm that has been contaminated with this chronic wasting disease, all of that meat, barring a few carcasses that tested positive, into the human food chain. The problem is that the tests aren't sensitive enough to detect early stages of the disease, which means that hundreds or thousands of those animals could have gone into the food chain and they would have been positive. Who knows?
Wow, no, it's unbelievable when
Sorry, yeah.
you know,
The bearer of bad news.
yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, in terms of the pushback, I mean, I looked at the map on the Bloodwatch website, and it seems that for the most part, the campaign is pretty successful. But obviously, you've still got some parts of Canada that haven't outlawed the sale of blood and plasma. Kind of, do you tend to find the pushback or the challenge is from the government or from plasma brokers? Where does that come from?
Well, the challenge for it's sort of multi-tiered. I mean, the problem is that Canada is not immune to the lobby of the plasma brokers and the big pharma industry. They sort of own Ottawa in many ways. So unfortunately, our current prime minister supports the export of Canadian blood plasma in these provinces. So he refuses to put a moratorium on the licenses that they give these companies, even though Canadian Blood Services, our national blood operator, has asked them to stop because they're trying to secure the supply chain. But primarily it's political. So you get even you get the health ministers and the cabinet ministers that run the treasury get from these plasma brokers and say, hey, we're going to set up, don't worry, you're going to have to spend less investing into public, the public health system. We're going to take over, we're going to give people $400 a month, we're going to bring jobs in a fractionation plant, and all will be well. Just let us do whatever we want. And so politicians say, that sounds great, jobs, I can run on a platform of jobs. And so it becomes real political inside baseball. So the provinces that allowed it, they didn't register on the lobby, so we couldn't get to them fast enough, to expose it. They had already permitted them to open.
Right.
And they're in hard up provinces in Canada. So they're in impoverished provinces that are hard up for money, that are looking for investment. And so they let these companies come in. And what that actually does is it depletes Canada's blood supply, because then those donors, all that plasma is shipped out. I mean, the company that's operating it's owned by a Chinese investment firm, essentially, where that plasma goes.
Wow. Well, I mean, as you know, we're currently in the midst of our own inquiry in the UK, or we were. But having had Krever, the trials, the tribulations, what challenges do you think we're likely to face in the UK inquiry?
I think it's very similar in terms of foot dragging, right? I mean, they use the mechanism of bureaucracy to exhaust people, because they know that the public is on the side of people who have been impacted, right? So you don't really have to gain public support, because you can go to anybody sitting at a coffee shop, tell them what happened to your family in 5 minutes, and they would be like, that's horrific, that's wrong.
Sure. Yeah.
And that is really the biggest, the biggest challenge is and you can't do it without champions within the government, who say, I will take on this fight. I know there's a MP there that has been really great, at sort of leading the charge, but without them just hammering home, we have to take care of these people. These people are our people. And we have to take ownership for our responsibility. It's not only crucial to get people proper compensation in the UK, but until that standard is set, there's going to be trouble for future generations. So because it's precedent setting, which of course is another reason why they don't want to complete it, because then they have to say, well, there it is in black and white.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I think and there are many, but I think one of the challenges in the UK is that I think here it's more difficult for us to get the full wealth of pharma documents. And you'll probably remember a couple of years ago, you were helping me with some Canadian documents, and it seems that some documents used in Krever are missing or are under a court seal. How much do we know about that now, and why is it that those documents used in Krever aren't just all accessible, online or something like that? It seems like they're kind of hidden away to some degree.
Well, they are. I mean, one of the problems is that they're basically in like big like containers. There were so many documents, and so they make it so difficult for you to acquire them, because they have to come ordered through boxes, right, to go to that National Library in Ottawa. You have to physically be there, right, with a librarian to try to peel through them. So they use that. The government knows they're not doing that. That is a choice. It's intentionally done, right, to make it difficult,
Sure.
For people to be able to access that information. And those are active decisions, and it's part of the injustice of how these public health catastrophes happen. It's one of the reasons why it's so important now with COVID-19 for people in Britain and Canada and all across the world to be filing freedom of information documents now, because they will try to all bury as much information as possible to pretend that they didn't know that COVID-19 had human-to-human transmission, which is completely malarkey. They did know. They just foot dragged because they knew they were going to have to shut down the economy, and with such strong measures, and they didn't want to do it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they always wait for dead people. They wait for dead people. That is what they do. So when they say evidence, we're waiting for evidence, they literally wait for bodies.
Yeah, I mean,
in his most important.
I had avoided, trying to draw parallels between what's going on now and what happened back in the 70s and 80s, but I think at a certain point it's very hard not to. And I've certainly had those thoughts, like what you were just describing, where you hear these phrases coming back of conclusive evidence and all of this before taking action, and it is like, how have we not learned those lessons from what happened in the 70s and 80s, particularly when it's not just, I say just, but this time it's not a defined group of people receiving blood and blood products. This is the entire globe, potentially, and how have we not learned those lessons?
Because they don't look at it from the point of policy of precaution. So if you have the precautionary principle hardwired into your public health policy, then the way that you respond to health emergencies is different. So you do everything you can to prevent harm instead of responding to a crisis. That's a completely different way of managing how government reacts. And so you out on that time, right? Like if we think, well, if they had gotten those tests out, if they did contract tracing, and if they just stopped people moving, even for like those crucial 3 weeks, think of how many lives could have been saved. Because they didn't work on the precautionary principle, they didn't send out public health notices. So all of those precious seniors who were dying across the world, the people that are running those places didn't even know that their seniors were at risk.
Absolutely. It's a very interesting and exhausting and tragic time, I think, that we're living in. But hey, I suppose we've all got to make do and get through it together. I mean, it does feel, coming back to our inquiry, and coronavirus, it feels slightly like, just as our inquiry was about to start getting into the nuts and bolts of all this, coronavirus came along, and now the hearings are on hold. And for everyone listening, what are there kind of key pieces of advice you would have for the campaigners, the victims, the families going through this inquiry here? What kind of advice, whether it's on an emotional level or a technical level or whatever, what key advice would you give to them?
No. Oh, geez, I tend to not like to give advice. I can you still hear me?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, okay, sorry. I think that I can only say what I've learned from other people, which is hold the line, because it's inevitable after years of advocacy and years of fighting, cracks, anger resurfaces, and it's hard, right? It's hard to keep perspective and to keep that, drive, keep everything public, like social media, because politicians hate that. They hate facts, you know, because people can sit there and debate truth philosophically, but there's just hard facts, right? And the reality is that what happened in Canada, in Britain, the United States, and other countries with tainted blood is the government did not react in time. They did things intentionally where they chose profit over public safety and the public good. Um, and they allowed the ignorance and homophobia of, HIV to cloud their judgment and how they take care of their fellow citizens and respond to a crisis. So hold the line and make sure you make everything public with social media. The more human that you can make it, with people's stories being shared, the more that you will gain champions. I remember when we did our reading of Tainted in the UK. I think it was at 2014 or 2015. And there was a group of hemophiliacs that came, and Tainted Blood campaigners. And they just won the room. I mean, everybody, all the other, British folks that were there at the reading had drinks with them, were listening, and they made a profound impact. I mean, they still bring them up to me today and ask me, you know what I mean? Like how people are doing,
Wow.
because they fundamentally want you guys to succeed. And so those two things are the hardest thing to do, is to hold the line.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's something that we struggle with, understandably, given how long this has gone on. To only have had our inquiry announced in 2017 is, I think one of the reasons we got the inquiry is everyone came together saying we want an inquiry. And it was very similar to when everyone came together saying we want compensation, something we're still yet to achieve, but it's very much there. And I think it's easy because it feels like once we got the inquiry, the government started to listen, or at least pretend to listen, to people in a way that they hadn't in years previous. And I feel like now the government will invite people to a room to listen. And I think certain sections of the campaign maybe feel like, because government are pretending to listen, that we should change our objective slightly to get what seems easier, rather than going for the full, we want what is right for people, what has been campaigned for years. So I think you're absolutely right about holding the line. I think that's key.
Yeah, it's and I think the only other thing that I would say is you will get there. It will happen. It will. You think it won't? I mean, I remember watching the footage of Randy, Janet's husband, testify. He died weeks after he testified at the Krever inquiry. I mean, he was on death's door, but she got him on the plane. She got him. He was given.
Wow.
That, it's very difficult for people to go public, but that's just what to support. There's nothing that you can't do and you can't achieve. It will happen. I guarantee it will happen. You just can't give up.
No, well, we certainly won't. I think we're coming up to 45 minutes, Kat. So I think we're gonna leave it there. But I say thank you very very much. There's quite a few people who have been listening and watching, who I'm sure greatly appreciate it as much as I do. No doubt we shall speak again soon. And that 45 minutes has gone very very fast. I know the line has struggled a bit at times, but for the most part it's been good. So I'm thankful for that. But Kat, thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much and stay safe.
And you, and you. Well, that was Kat Lanteigne, guys. As I say, co-founder of bloodwatch.org. Really good website, actually. I was on it before we did the live stream. So if you get a chance, definitely go and check out the bloodwatch.org website. Apologies, I know at times the line there went a bit bad. So it wasn't quite as sharp as our previous live streams because I've connected to Kat via Skype today as opposed to over the hard line. But I think we got there. For the most part, it was good. So as always, hope everyone's safe and all well and everything. I just want to say thank you to everyone that's been listening and watching and sharing. I was looking at some of the stats for the live streams today, and just in the last week, they've been seen like 4,000 times, which is certainly a far wider reach than I thought we'd get, especially within a 7-day period. So thank you to everyone. Anyone that's got a bit of time on their hands, I would certainly suggest on the inquiry website, the medical ethics report has been published up there. It's quite if you're someone that doesn't enjoy reading or might be sucked into it too much, maybe it's not for you. It's over 100 pages. I've read it. There's certainly some interesting stuff in there, kind of just for people that don't necessarily want to read it but want kind of a brief overview, in my opinion. There's some good stuff in there. It certainly talks about things that I thought might not necessarily be in there, such as the Nuremberg Code and the Declaration of Helsinki and these kind of pivotal human rights declarations, notions. I didn't think that stuff would be in there, and it was. So that's good. I think there's some concerning stuff in there, ranging from for instance, there was a paragraph in there that said, I'm paraphrasing, but it said people with HIV and hepatitis C have received support from the government since 1988. And whilst it's true that obviously I believe the first Macfarlane Trust payments went through in or around 88, that is not the case for hepatitis C, which came much later on. So that is flat out wrong. There are other things in there which are concerning in terms of when they're talking about kind of the ethics of risk and when to and when not to use a treatment. There are moments where you think you're reading something good, and I say good in the sense that it's in the favor of some of the arguments made by victims and families, and then the next sentence will say something to the effect of, but in some circumstances this might be okay if that, and the third. So it seems like there's a lot of kind of on the fenceness. It's balanced to the point of not having an opinion in parts. Now that's my personal view, and maybe it's not the intention of the report to go that far. So as I say, that's my personal opinion, so maybe take it with a pinch of salt. It's not all good and it's not all bad either. There's in terms of what's favourable to victims and families in the campaign. So it is on the inquiry website, as I say, and I believe that there will be more stuff being uploaded to the inquiry website soon. In terms of the live stream, I think we've had a good run really with guests, starting with Abraham Carpus. Lynn Kelly was on last Thursday, and obviously we spoke to Kat today. I'm uploading them just so you all know as well. Obviously they're on the Facebook page, and I have been uploading them to the YouTube channel sort of the day after as well. So they're on YouTube as well if you want to go and watch them there, if that's easier or whatever instead. We have got more guests coming in further weeks. I think possibly because the response from reaching out to people to come and do the live stream has been better than I thought it might be. So possibly, not yet, but possibly I might broaden this out to be Mondays and Thursdays as standard. But obviously if that happens, I shall let you all know. I think we're going to have a real good guest either next Monday or the Monday after. Someone that may well be as revelatory as Dr. Carpus was. So that could be really really cool if that happens. I'm trying. And also I'm half thinking about getting Dr. Carpus back on, because I think, you know, within the space of 45 minutes an hour, there's only so much we can cover, and I thought it was so important for Carpus to get that main story out a bit about the HIV testing. But I think he's got more to say, and I think the subjects we could have covered that we didn't. So I may well ask him to do the show again, as well as other people he has alluded to that may well come on. I do have to say as well, before we finish today, for fairness and balance and all that kind of thing, that in the Dr. Carpus live stream, he levelled a number of claims at various people, the main one being Robin Weiss. I reached out, I think it was the day after the interview with Carpus, to Robin Weiss and asked him if he wanted to come on the live stream to do an interview, to give his side of the story, and ask him whether he denies or not these claims made by Dr. Carpus. So far there's been no response from Robin Weiss, but I have reached out to him. He hasn't responded. I hope he does. You know, I would like Robin Weiss to come on here and to give his side of the story, whether that involves him saying, yeah, I did this, Dr. Carpus is right, or if he wants to come on here and say, it wasn't me, in the words of Shaggy, right? I just want him to come on here. So I have a feeling that Robin Weiss, or maybe people that know Robin Weiss, may be watching these streams, and if they are, you know, I want Robin Weiss to come on this show to address these claims, and I will do it in as an impartial way as is possible for, you know, someone in my position. I tried to remain absolutely impartial with Dr. Carpus. I simply asked him the questions, he said what he had to say, and I'm more than willing to do the same with Robin Weiss, and I think everyone else would be interested to hear it. So that's all I have to say on the Carpus Weiss matter. I would like Robin Weiss to come and do the live stream. So with that being said, thanks again to Kat. Go check out bloodwatch.org. You know, Kat's on Twitter and you can follow her there and all that stuff. So thanks again, everyone, and we shall see you all again next Monday.